There are failures in war that happen because a force is too weak, too poorly equipped, or too exhausted to resist what is coming against it. And then there are failures that happen because the structure of the defense itself contains a weakness that the defenders do not fully recognize until an opponent has already built an operation around exploiting it. What unfolded in the Belgorod sector belongs to the second category. This was not a story of Ukrainian forces smashing through overwhelming fortifications with sheer combat power. It was a story about what happens when the seams inside a defensive system become more important than the strength of the defenses themselves. Watch the seam carefully, because the seam is where the failure began. Along the Belgorod border region, responsibility for the defense was divided between two different command structures that had evolved around two very different understandings of what the border represented. One structure viewed the border primarily as a security problem. Its purpose was to monitor crossings, prevent infiltration, manage low-intensity incursions, and maintain stability in the region. The other structure viewed the border as a military problem. Its responsibility was defending against organized armed force operating with the coordination, equipment, and firepower of a modern army. On paper, the division appeared logical. In practice, it created a dangerous structural vulnerability. The two organizations operated under different assumptions. They used different communication systems. They answered to different chains of command. They trained for different kinds of threats and operated under different procedures for escalation and response. Each structure understood its own mission clearly enough inside its own sphere of responsibility. But where those responsibilities met, clarity disappeared. The boundary between the two systems became a space where assumptions overlapped without fully integrating into a coherent defense. That boundary was the seam, and Ukrainian planners had been studying that seam for considerably longer than the defenders had been treating it as a vulnerability. This is the first point that must be understood if you want to understand what actually happened near Belgorod. Defensive systems do not usually fail where they are strongest. They fail where their assumptions are weakest. Fortifications, minefields, checkpoints, surveillance systems, and reserve forces matter enormously. But they only function effectively when the organizational structure behind them can integrate those tools into a unified response. When the organizational structure itself contains gaps, those gaps become operational opportunities. Every serious student of military history eventually learns the same principle. Boundaries between commands are among the most dangerous places in any defense. They are where coordination is hardest. They are where responsibility is most likely to become ambiguous. They are where each structure often assumes the other is managing part of the problem. And they are where attackers concentrate their attention once they understand how the defense is organized. The Ukrainian operation in the Belgorod sector was built around exactly that understanding. This is important because much of the public discussion surrounding operations like this tends to focus almost entirely on physical defenses. Analysts count trenches, barriers, artillery positions, observation posts, and troop numbers. But Ukrainian planning appears to have focused less on the fortifications themselves and more on the coordination architecture that was supposed to make those fortifications function as a coherent defensive system. That distinction matters enormously. The Ukrainian planners were not simply asking where the defenses were strongest or weakest physically. They were asking deeper questions. Which structure was responsible for responding to a rapidly developing cross-border penetration? How long did it take for information to move between the security structure and the military structure? Which authority could override jurisdictional boundaries in an emergency? Which threats were categorized as security incidents and which were categorized as military operations? What happened when an event evolved from one category into the other faster than the bureaucracy could adapt? Those are not questions about trenches, they are questions about organizational friction. And organizational friction is often deadlier than physical weakness. The Ukrainian intelligence picture of the sector appears to have been built around understanding the defense as a coordination problem, rather than simply as a fortification problem. That approach revealed something extremely important. The defense was strongest where responsibility was clear. It was strongest where each structure fully understood its role and had concentrated its resources accordingly. But it was weakest where responsibilities overlapped or became ambiguous. Those weak points were not accidental. They were structural consequences of the arrangement itself, and they became the focus of the operation. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to understand how multi-structure defensive systems actually function under pressure. Any defensive arrangement divided between multiple commands depends on two things working together simultaneously: coverage and coordination. Coverage means forces are physically present across the area being defended. Coordination means those forces can operate as a unified system when confronted with a fast-moving threat. Remove either one, and the defense begins to fail. A defense can possess excellent coverage while suffering catastrophic coordination failures. In that situation, forces exist in sufficient numbers, fortifications exist in sufficient depth, and firepower exists in sufficient quantity, but the system cannot integrate those resources quickly enough to respond coherently to a threat crossing between commands. That is what appears to have happened in Belgorod. The resources existed, the personnel existed, the fortifications existed, but the coordination architecture required to integrate them into a single defensive response was not built for the kind of operation that developed across the sector. The Ukrainian operation was designed specifically to exploit that limitation. This is where the distinction between attacking a defense and attacking the coordination of a defense becomes critical. Traditional military thinking often focuses on destroying enemy forces directly, but modern operations increasingly target the processes that allow enemy forces to function coherently in the first place. Communications networks, command relationships, procedural delays, bureaucratic divisions, and jurisdictional boundaries become targets every bit as important as physical positions on the ground. The Belgorod operation appears to have been structured around exactly that principle. The objective was not simply to penetrate fortifications, it was to force the defensive structures into a situation where effective response required rapid coordination across the seam between commands faster than the coordination architecture could realistically achieve. That is an extraordinarily sophisticated operational concept. It required Ukrainian planners to understand not only the terrain and fortifications, but also the procedural relationships between the Russian structures defending them. They needed to understand how authority flowed, where delays emerged, which decisions required approval from higher command, and how each structure interpreted rapidly changing events. This category of intelligence is exceptionally difficult to develop. Most military assessments focus heavily on physical capability while paying less attention to organizational structure. But organizational structure often determines whether physical capability can actually be applied effectively under combat conditions. The Ukrainian operation demonstrated an understanding of the Russian defensive arrangement that the defenders themselves may not have fully recognized as a vulnerability. That asymmetry of understanding became decisive. When the operation began developing through the seam between the structures, neither command initially reacted as though the entire threat belonged fully within its authority. The security-oriented structure addressed the aspects it understood as a border security issue. The military-oriented structure addressed the aspects it understood as a military problem. But the elements existing between those categories became trapped inside the ambiguity created by the divided arrangement. This is the critical point. The defenders did not fail because individual commanders were incompetent or inactive. They responded largely as their structures had conditioned them to respond. The problem was that the structures themselves were not designed for a rapidly evolving threat operating directly through the boundary between their responsibilities. The vulnerability was structural, and structural vulnerabilities are uniquely dangerous because they are often invisible to the institutions living inside them. Administrative arrangements become normalized over time. Procedures that developed under one set of conditions continue operating even after the strategic environment changes fundamentally. That is exactly what appears to have happened along the Belgorod border. For most of its modern history, the border was primarily a security space rather than an active operational military zone. The structures managing it evolved appropriately for that environment. The division between security responsibilities and military responsibilities made practical sense under those conditions. But the conditions changed. The border transformed from a security problem into an operational military environment, and the organizational structure did not adapt with the same speed as the threat environment itself. That gap between evolving threat and static structure became exploitable. Once the Ukrainian operation demonstrated the vulnerability, the Russian command responded with measures that were, in many respects, professionally appropriate. Reinforcements were committed. Higher authorities intervened to coordinate the two structures more directly. Reserves were shifted toward the penetration. Command relationships were elevated to levels where jurisdictional boundaries could be overridden. None of those responses reflected institutional collapse or incompetence, but they encountered a severe problem. The coordination required to contain the situation had to be imposed on structures that had not been designed to operate under unified control during fast-moving boundary-crossing operations. Different procedures, different assumptions, and different communication systems created delays precisely when time mattered most. The response was correct in principle, but constrained by the same structural weaknesses that had created the vulnerability in the first place. That is what makes this case so important from a doctrinal perspective. The organizational structure of a defense is itself part of the defense. Command relationships, bureaucratic boundaries, coordination procedures, and authority chains are not merely administrative details sitting behind the battlefield. They are operational realities that determine how quickly and effectively a defense can react under pressure. A vulnerability in organizational structure can be just as dangerous as a vulnerability in physical fortifications. In some cases, it can be even more dangerous because organizational vulnerabilities are harder to recognize. Defenders experience them as ordinary administrative reality. The structures feel normal because they have existed for years. Their limitations become invisible through familiarity. Attackers do not experience them that way. Attackers study them as opportunities. The most important variable in a divided defensive system is not necessarily the strength of the individual commands. It is the speed and reliability with which those commands can coordinate during rapidly developing crises, especially near the boundaries where their responsibilities meet. And those boundaries are almost always the hardest places to coordinate effectively. This lesson extends far beyond Belgorod and far beyond this particular war. Military establishments around the world operate through layered bureaucracies and divided jurisdictions. Border forces, interior security services, military districts, intelligence agencies, territorial commands, cyber commands, air defense structures, and regional authorities often coexist within the same defensive environment while operating under partially separate systems of authority and communication. In peacetime, those divisions can function adequately for years without obvious problems, but under combat conditions, especially against an opponent who has studied the structure carefully, those boundaries can become dangerous operational seams. This is not unique to Russia. It is a recurring problem throughout military history. Again and again, defensive failures emerge where institutional responsibilities overlap imperfectly. In 1940, German operations repeatedly exploited seams between Allied formations during the Battle of France. During the Arab-Israeli Wars, coordination gaps between commands frequently created opportunities for penetration. In Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgent groups regularly exploited jurisdictional divisions between coalition forces, local security structures, and intelligence agencies. Modern warfare consistently demonstrates that fragmented authority creates exploitable vulnerabilities when coordination cannot keep pace with rapidly evolving threats. The Belgorod case simply provides an especially clear modern example. What makes it particularly instructive is the degree to which the operation appears to have been designed specifically around organizational analysis rather than simply tactical assault. Ukrainian planners seem to have understood that the decisive factor was not necessarily destroying the defenses physically, but forcing the defending structures into a coordination crisis they were not organized to solve quickly enough. That is a very different kind of military thinking. It reflects a recognition that modern warfare increasingly rewards forces capable of understanding how enemy systems function institutionally rather than merely physically. The battlefield is no longer defined solely by terrain, firepower, and troop concentrations. It is also defined by information flow, bureaucratic speed, procedural adaptability, and organizational integration. Wars are fought not only against armies, but against systems, and systems often fail first at their seams. There is another important lesson here that military institutions frequently resist acknowledging. Strong defensive systems are not necessarily those with the most fortifications or the largest concentration of forces. They are the systems most capable of adapting their organizational structures to changing threats. That adaptability is extraordinarily difficult. Institutions naturally preserve the arrangements that worked previously. Procedures become standardized. Jurisdictions become entrenched. Chains of command become politically and administratively difficult to reorganize. Every large organization develops internal resistance to structural change, particularly when the existing system appears functional during normal conditions. But war punishes institutional inertia ruthlessly. The threat environment evolves continuously. Technologies change. Operational methods change. The distinction between security space and military space can collapse rapidly under modern conditions. And when the environment changes faster than the structure managing it, seams begin to emerge between institutional assumptions and operational reality. Those seams are where intelligent attackers focus their attention. What happened near Belgorod was therefore not merely a localized penetration. It was a demonstration of how organizational assumptions can become operational liabilities when left unexamined for too long. The Russian structures involved were not irrational. Their division of responsibilities had historical logic behind it. The arrangement developed under conditions where the border genuinely functioned more as a security issue than as an active military front. But once the environment transformed, the arrangement required faster adaptation than it appears to have received. Ukraine recognized the lag and then built an operation around it. That is why the seam mattered more than the fortifications themselves. Fortifications can slow attackers, channel movement, and impose costs. But fortifications do not think. They do not coordinate responses independently. Their effectiveness depends entirely on the organizational system controlling them. When that system becomes divided, delayed, or uncertain at critical points, physical strength alone cannot compensate quickly enough. The most dangerous condition for any defensive arrangement is therefore not simply facing a strong enemy. It is facing an enemy who understands the assumptions built into the defense better than the defenders themselves understand them. That is the deeper significance of Belgorod. The penetration itself has largely been contained. The vulnerable sectors have reportedly undergone reorganization. Coordination mechanisms have almost certainly been revised with much greater urgency now that the vulnerability has been demonstrated publicly and operationally. Assessments are undoubtedly being conducted regarding how command integration should function under similar conditions going forward. But structural lessons learned after a failure are always more expensive than lessons learned beforehand. And the broader implications extend far beyond one sector of one conflict. How many defensive arrangements around the world still rely on assumptions developed under older strategic conditions? How many border systems remain divided between security and military structures that would struggle to integrate rapidly during fast-moving operations? How many commands continue measuring defensive strength primarily through troop numbers and fortifications, while underestimating the operational importance of coordination speed? Those are uncomfortable questions for every military institution, because they force organizations to examine not only what resources they possess, but how effectively their structures can integrate those resources under pressure. The uncomfortable reality is that many defensive systems probably contain seams similar to the one exploited near Belgorod. Some exist between military branches. Some exist between civilian and military authorities. Some exist between regional commands. Some exist between intelligence agencies and operational forces. Others exist between national governments and local administrations responsible for crisis response. Most remain invisible until tested, and once tested, the consequences develop very quickly. That is ultimately why the Belgorod operation deserves careful study. Not because it proves one side uniquely brilliant or the other uniquely flawed, but because it demonstrates a timeless principle of warfare with unusual clarity. Defenses fail where assumptions go unexamined. Organizational seams become operational vulnerabilities when adversaries study them more carefully than the defenders do. And the speed of coordination across divided structures often matters more than the physical strength of the structures individually. The defenders of the Belgorod sector discovered that reality in the most unforgiving way possible. The boundary they had experienced primarily as an administrative arrangement had quietly evolved into the most dangerous point in the entire defensive system. The attackers recognized that transformation before the defenders did, and by the time the defenders fully understood the nature of the vulnerability, the operation had already moved through the seam faster than the structure designed to contain it could effectively respond. That is the lesson every military institution should be studying now, because the next great defensive failure in another conflict, somewhere else in the world, may already exist today inside an organizational boundary that still looks perfectly normal to the people responsible for defending it.